there's something about working in sexual and reproductive health that is this powerful bridge connector. Everybody needs to talk about these things, and nearly everybody doesn't have enough spaces in which to talk about them. Topics around reproductive health, around reproduction, around sexual health, they open up these opportunities for a really personal lens into each other's lives and a really personal connection. And I think that's one of the things that I've loved about this work, is it's this way to connect to somebody that feels powerful and important and authentic and impactful. And personally, I haven't felt that in other work that I've done.
Welcome back to another episode of the Protect the World podcast. Every month, I connect with a different not-for-profit organisation that's making the world a better place. My goal is to learn about the issues they're tackling, interview the founder or director, and then share their stories with you. But I don't just want to share their stories. I want to contribute to their work as well. If you'd like to help me, you can sign up to the Patreon via the link in the show notes. The voice you heard at the beginning of this podcast belongs to Eleanor Unsworth, Executive Director of Wings Guatemala. Wings is a not-for-profit organisation that's been working for over 2 decades to improve access to reproductive health services and education in Guatemala, with a focus on rural communities. They run health clinics, mobile services, and youth education programs with the aim of ensuring that every Guatemalan has access to the reproductive rights they deserve. In this episode, Eleanor and I discuss the current state of reproductive rights in Guatemala, the nation's complex history, and the impressive plans that Wings has for the future. Eleanor is a deep listener with a warm and generous character, and she believes strongly in both the work that she does and the people it affects. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I hope you do as well. So now I bring you Eleanor Unsworth, Executive Director of Wings Guatemala. Eleanor Unsworth, a very warm welcome to the Protect the World podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. Thank you, Brady. Thanks for having me.
I want to start by asking, who are you and how do you describe yourself?
Sure. Well, as you said, my name is Eleanor Unsworth. I'm the Executive Director here at Wings Guatemala, which is a reproductive health organization that provides services in underserved communities across Guatemala. I'm originally from the US, but I've built my life here in Guatemala. I am a mom. I'm a feminist. I'm someone who strives to center joy in my work and in my life, while also taking on work in a life that involves confronting really heavy realities that we live in. What else? I am a mediocre dancer and a terrible singer and a really good cook. I am determined. I listen. That centers a lot of how I move through my life. And I would say even in the face of the state of human rights as we have it right now, that is heartbreaking and enraging, I am an optimist, and I'm somebody who really believes in the dignity and power and beauty in people.
Brilliant. That was a really beautiful summary. Thank you. And thanks for joining me today. Hopefully an easy question to get the ball rolling. What are reproductive rights? What kind of rights are we talking about here?
Yeah. Reproductive rights in the work within Guatemala, we are particularly, within Wings, we are particularly focused on the rights of individuals to decide whether to have children, when to have children, how many children to have. we believe and we know that the ability to choose family sizes and make informed, active decisions around childbearing is the foundational cornerstone to a lot of other social outcomes in communities. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that today. But that's the piece of reproductive rights that we're really focused on, is that question of bodily autonomy around the choice to have kids and whether, when, and how many kids to have.
Brilliant. That sort of ties in. Your organization has this motto: it all begins with reproductive rights. Tell me, what exactly is it that begins with reproductive rights? What are you referring to there?
Yeah. When we see families or individuals that don't have this ability to choose actively whether and how many kids to have, what we see is that then is detrimental to a lot of social outcomes. For example, if I can't control the number of kids I have, I'm less likely to be able to feed all of my children well. And in Guatemala, half of kids are malnourished. If I can't choose how many kids to have, then the kids I do have are less likely to have access to education. And in Guatemala, 22% of Indigenous women have no access to education. Only about 9% of Indigenous girls get through secondary school. The average access to education is one of the worst in the region here in Guatemala. If I can't choose how many kids to have, there's more likely to be violence at home. Kids are stressful. And pregnancy and childbearing can be a way to control someone and keep them in a violent situation as well. It limits our ability to be able to escape domestic violence. If I am a teen and I can't choose when to have my kids, then I'm less likely to finish school. I'm less likely to have economic opportunities, job opportunities that could help me get out of poverty and all of its impacts. So Guatemala is a country that has myriad social issues. And what we believe is that this fundamental right to choose whether and when and how many kids to have is one of the first pieces that needs to be in place to create this domino effect of allowing people to provide more opportunities for themselves and their families and their communities.
Great. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit to the history of Guatemala. And you mentioned there that education, nutrition, and obviously reproductive rights are low compared to even some other countries in the region. Were there particular moments in Guatemala's history that have led us to this point? Or how would you sort of explain where we've arrived at today in Guatemala?
Yeah. It's an informed question, I can tell, Brody. Guatemala has had a really hard 100 years. And certainly before that, we could look at struggles around colonization and violence as well. But I think it's important to look at the last sort of 80 years or so in Guatemala and what's happened. Guatemala had, for the first time in a very long time, its really first sort of truly democratically elected president. And he was focused in large part on land rights. A lot of land in Guatemala had been taken up for, in particular, sugarcane and other crops to be exported. And he was really focused on returning land to the people. And that upset a lot of powerful actors, including the U.S. at the time. The U.S. at the time, if I'm not mistaken, the head of the CIA and the Secretary of State were brothers, and they were both on the board of United Fruit Company and had personal interest in United Fruit Company not losing land in Guatemala, and helped to support a coup here that then, it's a complex history that someone else could speak to in a much more informed way for the entirety of this podcast. But to sort of summarize it, it then launched into nearly 30 years of civil war here that is often referred to as an armed conflict here. And within that armed conflict, there were years of genocide as well committed in indigenous communities in the north. And in the early 90s, peace accords were signed. But I think a lot of people would say that not a lot changed. The same few families remained in power, and they created and continued to kind of perpetuate a very weak state, a very corrupt state that did not have the social programs to actually support the population, because they, I would say, weren't interested in actually supporting the population. An undereducated population is easier to control. A malnourished population is easier to control. And so what we have seen since the early 90s is a state that, despite the fact that Guatemala has quite significant wealth in some sectors, that wealth is so heavily concentrated in such few people and such few families. The infrastructure of the country is completely broken. There are many communities without transportation, without access by road. The healthcare infrastructure is completely broken. Several years ago, there was a corruption scandal that led to an even more dramatic defunding of the hospitals. And just to give you an idea, in those years, if you needed to go to the hospital and you needed to get a surgery, they would give you a list of what you needed to go buy: the needles, the sutures, the medications, everything, because their shelves were empty. And so they had staff, not always paid, but they had staff, but they had no supplies. And many, many people died in that time because of the complete defunding of healthcare that was committed because of a corruption, essentially money laundering scandal by the heads of state at the time. Most recently, we're in this particularly interesting moment right now because last year was an election cycle here in Guatemala, and Bernardo Arevalo was the surprise winner of the general election. The sort of presumed front-runner candidates and powers that backed them had done a lot to get any perceived competition thrown out of the race. And I think they just didn't think that he stood a chance. And then he won, and that launched us into over 100 days of national movement and protest against the illegal and unconstitutional attempts to throw out the election results so that he could not take office. And again, that's something we could go into great detail on, but the short version is that he has taken office. He is actually the son of the former President Arevalo, who I mentioned earlier, was democratically elected president here right before the armed conflict. And so it feels like a very historic moment right now. And I think the country, a lot of people are hopeful that this is a step towards a stronger democracy in Guatemala, a true democracy, and hopefully a stronger system of public support for the population. Hopefully we will begin to see public institutions re-strengthened and actually functioning going forward and serving the population that they're meant to serve.
That was an excellent summary. I do want to mostly focus on the work that your organization is doing, but I think it is really important to place it in that political and historical context as well. Tell me about the state of reproductive rights right now in Guatemala. How is it for people trying to access the kinds of services that you offer?
Our focus is primarily on those individuals who don't have easy access. So as I said, there is wealth in Guatemala. There is a functioning healthcare system for those who can pay out the nose for it. But for the vast majority of the population, there is very limited access, if any. 1 in 3 indigenous women in Guatemala has no access to reproductive health. I believe, I'm not mistaken, that on average, folks living in rural areas have to travel at least 5 miles, which often means by foot, to get to the nearest health outpost, and that isn't necessarily actually supplied. So in a lot of communities where we provide services, for example, there are what are called centros de convergencia that may open once a week or twice a month to provide vaccinations primarily and some other basic services. But in terms of ongoing access, they're quite limited. Our organization focuses a lot on access to contraception. And I would say the Ministry of Health does generally have short-acting contraceptive methods available. So injections, pills, for example. They may go out of stock because the purchase process nationally for that can be, we have seen it interrupted for many reasons many times, and we see stockouts happen regularly nationally. The Ministry of Health has very limited capacity to provide the primary services that we provide, which are long-acting methods like IUDs and implants, and permanent methods like tubal ligations and vasectomies. That is in part a challenge nationally because of the supplies involved, and it's very much a challenge nationally because of the training involved for staff to be able to, for clinical providers to be able to offer these services. And so for us, it's a very important piece of the national puzzle to be able to provide free access to long-acting and permanent contraception for those who need it, because for most of our patients, they really don't have another option of how to access those services.
Great. And could you run me through each of those services? You touched on a couple there, but in terms of day-to-day on the ground, what is it that I had a quick look at your website, the calendar on your website, and it is jam-packed. So tell me, how are you actually delivering these services to communities?
Absolutely. So we have 2 traditional clinics, one here in our primary headquarters in Antigua and one in Zone 7 of Guatemala City, which is near the largest garbage dump in Central America and the communities that surround it and work within it. And then most of our clinical services are provided through our mobile units. We have mobile units stationed throughout the country in different regions. Those mobile units are not like what you might see in a more developed country. So like in the US, when you say mobile unit, you think about a bus that you walk onto and there's a clinic inside the vehicle. Our vehicles have to drive across rivers and off-road, and we couldn't take one of those types of vehicles. So what we do is we pack a box truck with everything we need to then do a pop-up clinic in communities. We can use, for example, schools, churches, community centers, homes, and local clinics to provide IUDs, implants, and cervical cancer screenings. That's one type of pop-up clinic that we offer. IUDs are an intrauterine device, so it's a T-shaped device that goes inside the uterus and can prevent pregnancy for up to 10 years. An implant refers to, in this country, a 2-rod, so they're like little flexible matchsticks, sort of, that go under the skin in the arm and can prevent pregnancy for up to 5 years. And then we always offer cervical cancer screenings. In Guatemala, cervical cancer is the leading cause of cancer-related death among Guatemalan women, even though it should be really entirely preventable. And a lot of that is about access to screening for women here. The public health system here does screening through what most people know as a PAP, but that requires coming back for results 2 weeks later. And very rarely do patients actually end up receiving those results. They sort of feel that by having done the exam, they've done what they needed to. And even that, there are lots of barriers of access. And so we'll see often that women are only getting PAPs in the context, for example, of a pregnancy. We do a different type of screening called a visual inspection with acetic acid, a VIA, and that allows us to have results within 2 minutes and offer treatment for low-grade precancerous lesions in the moment. So we provide those services anywhere we go. So that long-acting contraceptive clinic is one way. And then we have over 50 partner hospitals across the country that lend us an operating room for the day. And through them, we can offer tubal ligations and vasectomies, which are our permanent contraceptive options. So tubal ligations and vasectomies we can offer to anyone over 18. And then all of our other services we can offer to anyone over 14.
Great. And all of this is free,
Correct.
Fantastic. You touched on a little bit there. Could you talk a little bit about how your organization's approach differs when working with youth and adolescents when compared to adults?
Absolutely. Yes, well, it's worth mentioning we have a youth peer education program. We have one based here in the central region of the country. We have one in the western region, and we're hoping soon to launch one in the northern region of the country. That education program, we train at least 50 adolescents each year to then provide education to their peers. So what we know about teenagers is that they're at a developmental stage where they don't care what adults have to say, and they do care a lot what their peers have to say. And so we harness that influence that teens have on each other to encourage healthy decision-making among adolescents. And so our teen peer educators can then do workshops in their communities around things like pregnancy prevention, condom use, partner communication, parent communication, healthy decision-making, power dynamics in relationships, and much more. They can also provide counseling to peers and refer them to services when needed. So that's one of the building blocks of how we approach working with adolescents. We also have adolescent counselors on staff. We know that teens need to talk about a lot more when it comes to sexual and reproductive health. Oftentimes, if we're seeing somebody who's maybe in their mid-20s or up, they perhaps already have children, they've perhaps already used some contraceptive method before. The conversations tend to be more about what are the contraceptive options and what's going to be the best fit for them. But with teens, we're talking a lot about, again, power dynamics in relationships. Are they feeling pressured? Are they feeling free to make their own decisions about even just whether to have sex, right? Do they have support from their family? Do they need help talking to their parents about anything around their relationship or anything else? We have teens who need to talk about questions coming up around sexual orientation and identity. And then contraceptive, in some cases, is a piece of the counseling that they need. So we have these adolescent counselors who are able to really provide a much more holistic approach to counseling and education for our teens. And then we've got a training process happening to have all of our nurses also able to provide that level of counseling for teens that are being seen in other sites where we may not have an adolescent counselor available.
Amazing. It sounds like you've really thought about every sort of level to it. That's great. But where do you recruit your youth mentors from? How do they come into the program?
It's the hardest when we're launching a program, because once we have a program going, they refer each other. So our teens who are in the program talk about it with friends and classmates and cousins and neighbors and refer other youth. And what we see, again, is that they are most motivated by each other. And so teens who are referred to the program by a participant are more likely to be engaged and to continue long term. Teens who are referred by a teacher or an adult mentor or an adult family member are slightly less likely to stay, because we think they probably are coming in because of some sense of obligation and not so much as a feeling of a motivation, a self-motivation. But when we're starting out, what we often do is go and have our staff of the program do workshops in schools, and through those workshops promote the program and recruit. But we do see it takes generally a couple of years to kind of build up the momentum and get a group that then self-recruits and self-sustains. Yeah,
definitely. Could you talk to me a little bit more about the communities that you're working with? For people, you mentioned that most of them are rural communities, but I guess for people who haven't been to Guatemala, could you sort of describe what those communities are like and the different types of communities that you're working in?
Yeah. Guatemala is an incredibly diverse country in a very small area. So for someone with U.S. context, we would say that the land mass of Guatemala is roughly the size of Tennessee. Within that live approximately 20 million people. 24 languages are spoken. And that includes 22 Mayan languages, many of which could be subdivided into regional dialects that may or may not be mutually intelligible. So that's just one lens through which we can recognize diversity across Guatemala. There's also a lot of climate diversity in Guatemala. So there are colder mountainous regions with pine forests, and there are beaches. There are very hot desert regions. We have volcanic black sand beaches, and we have white sand Caribbean beaches. It's an incredible, just topographically and in terms of getting around Guatemala, it's complex topography and really diverse and fascinating topography. So Guatemala is divided into departments. There are 22 departments. We currently provide services in 19 of them. This year we'll add 2 more, and next year we'll add the final frontier of Petén, the northernmost department, and have national coverage. In terms of, what are these communities that we're serving? What are they like? It's kind of hard to summarize because of that level of diversity. Again, we have communities like Momostenango, that's 90% indigenous, cold, mountainous, pine forest, beautiful community. And we have coastal communities on the southern coast that, again, are in sort of desert coastal regions. Those can be regions very heavily impacted often by malnutrition. We do have, I would say, more of a balance these days between a rural and urban approach than when we started as an organization. I think there was a lot more focus on rurality. But what we've seen over the last 20 years in the country is a lot of urbanization pushed by economic hardship in rural areas. And what that means is that there is also a lot of need and lack of access in urban and peri-urban areas. And so we've sort of begun to balance more our ability to provide services in those really remote rural areas and also to the communities that need these services and don't have access in slightly more urban settings.
Amazing. I love that long-term vision of getting to all of the departments. That's really exciting. Tell me a little bit more about the team you have working with you. Tell us about your staff.
Yeah, we have a team of just over 100 staff. We have staff spread out among 5 offices right now across the country. I always think it's important to note that when I'm the person that people meet wings through, I'm not a good representation of our staff. We have 2 Americans on staff, myself and our development director, and I would say we are both committed to succession plans of working ourselves and Americans out of jobs in this organization. And so it's really important to us that our staff represents and comes from the communities that we serve. We currently have a focus on how to continue to increase diversity across our staff, again, given that diversity across the country, and make sure that we continue to hold ourselves to that standard of representation of the regions that we serve. Our mobile units are generally staffed by a group of 3 or 4 nurses, a driver. We have a couple of educators in each region who help promote our services and coordinate the pop-up clinics. And we have contract surgeons who, again, are all Guatemalan, who come in to provide those permanent contraceptive methods on those specific days. I don't know how else I can describe. We have an amazingly dedicated staff. I am inspired by them daily. And I think one of the things that I love about our team, one of many things I love about our team, is that each and every person that you talk to on the team has a reason that they are connected to this work. We have one of our drivers whose mom died of uterine cancer, and that launched him into wanting to work around cervical cancer prevention. We have many staff who have seen the generational struggles of women in their families not having access to contraception or the freedom to use it, the opportunity to use it. We have many staff who have come from experiences of domestic or other forms of violence and understand the importance of this work as violence prevention as well. So I think what that results in a day-to-day sense is that all of our staff, be them field staff or office staff, feel a personal connection to the work that we're doing and the importance of the impact that this work can have. And that level of dedication is energizing across the organization.
Sounds like a fantastic team you've got going. I'm interested, tell me, you touched on that future vision a little bit, but long-term vision for the organization. In terms of places you're working, goals that you're aspiring to, staffing, that kind of thing. What does the perfect version of Wings look like?
I laugh because I don't know. I think I run from the word perfect. It's in its nature unrealistic, but and this is also a really interesting time to ask that question because we're at this moment of seeing this vision of national presence just beyond our fingertips. When that vision was created, that strategic plan was created in 2019 and formalized at the end of 2019 to carry us from 2020 through 2025. And as we all know, very shortly into 2020 and launching this very ambitious strategic plan, at the time we had coverage, if I'm not mistaken, in 7 departments, and our idea was in 5 years to get to 22. So it was quite a lot of growth to take on. And as we all know, a lot of things changed in ways that we didn't anticipate in 2020. And here, the effects of the pandemic in terms of hospital settings and education settings really lasted all the way through 2021. And it was only in 2022 that we started to have access again to hospitals and to schools. And yet, we are staying on track, I would say remarkably, to achieve this national coverage on the original timeline. So on the one hand, it's really interesting to be at this moment where we're actually seeing we're only a couple of steps away and it feels achievable. There's still a lot to do, but it feels like it's really going to happen. At the same time, it's an interesting moment because we're just now launching what will be a about a 10-month-long participatory strategic planning process to come up with that next vision. So we're involving our staff, our community advisory boards, our beneficiaries, some local partners, donors in helping to shape that next vision. And what I love about that process is it's not really for me to answer this question. You know, I'm a piece of a community that surrounds the organization that will answer that question of what the long-term vision is. I can say I think there are questions coming up in that process about how we can harness the model of service delivery that we already have to perhaps provide additional services within sexual and reproductive health. I think there are questions about how we can scale up our interventions with adolescents. I think there's a lot of focus on making sure that we double down on questions of quality in the work that we do. For us, that level of responsibility around how we deliver our services is a really defining characteristic. And as anyone who's been in an organization that has gone through rapid scaling up knows, that rapid growth can be a risk to questions of how we deliver services. It requires more supervision, more systematization, more training, et cetera. And so I feel confident that that question of how we continue to center values around quality and responsibility will be at the center of a next strategic plan. But I think there's a lot of interesting possibilities, and I'm excited to see what the community will ask of us.
It does. It all sounds very exciting. Digging a little deeper now, I guess when a lot of people think of reproductive rights, one of the words that springs to mind is abortion. Firstly, could you explain the current situation in Guatemala with regards to abortion?
Yeah. So in Guatemala, abortion is legal in the case that the mother's life is at risk, if the pregnancy continues. However, law dictates that 2 separate doctors need to sign off and certify that her life is at risk. And the reality is that just doesn't happen. And so, like every country across the world where abortion is illegal or heavily limited, what that leads to is a large market for informal and unregulated and mostly quite dangerous access to abortion services. I think it's also interesting to mention that abortion is highly politicized in Guatemala, as it is around the world. And about 2 years ago, the then president, Congress passed a law that would have heavily criminalized abortion to the point that we've seen in other countries in the region where even women who were having miscarriages would have risked jail time. And there were a number of things in there about jail time, even for individuals who referred someone for an abortion, even if they didn't provide that abortion, but if they educated around it or supported that service in any way. And they also included in that bill heavy limitations around sex education in schools, including the restriction that the only family model that could be discussed would be of a married mother and father with children. So no mention of single parents, of unmarried parents, much less of, for example, families of gay parents, or any mention of sexual diversity. That bill was signed into law, I was actually going into labor with my daughter when that bill was signed into law. And then by the time I got out of the hospital, the president had quietly vetoed it under significant international pressure, but not before throwing a party and erecting a statue and proclaiming Guatemala the pro-life capital of Latin America. So he celebrated this law. He declared a Guatemalan stance around abortion and then vetoed the law. But I think that's indicative of politically where most of the establishment in Guatemala stands on the issue of abortion.
Right. Where does the morning after pill Plan B fall into this equation? Is it legal, accessible?
Yes, it is, or at least one form of it is. There are two kinds of emergency contraception. There's one that works to prevent ovulation. So emergency contraception is Plan B is the perfect name, the brand name, because it is never meant to be anyone's primary contraceptive, but it's meant to be used if your contraceptive method failed. So for example, a condom broke, or if under whatever circumstances you had unprotected sex and want to still prevent pregnancy. The most widely known version works to prevent ovulation. So a pregnancy can happen up to 5 days after unprotected sex, and that's because of various things of anatomy that I don't know how much we want to get into. But by preventing ovulation within those 5 days, we can prevent pregnancy. That version of emergency contraception is legal in Guatemala, and we do distribute it. There's another version of emergency contraception that prevents implantation. So after ovulation and after fertilization, the kind of final step to prevent a pregnancy with this kind of emergency contraception is to prevent implantation. That version is not regulated, not available in Guatemala, and we do not distribute it.
And I guess that would come down to constitutional definitions in terms of when life begins. Is that why certain methods are legal and not? Or?
I don't know. What I can say is that the latter version has simply not been, what the Guatemalan version of FDA approved is. That drug has not been approved on market. I don't know that it's been specifically deemed illegal, but it's just not been medically approved for use in Guatemala. But I do think that the difference in why one is medically approved and the other is not does connect back to a concept of when life begins.
Yeah. Okay. And tell me a little bit about the sort of activism space. Is it legal for people or organizations to advocate for more relaxed abortion laws? Is that something that's dangerous or problematic in any way?
Yes. In general, I would say political activism in Guatemala is dangerous. There are currently dozens of judges and lawyers and activists and journalists who have been either forced into exile or jailed for speaking out in ways that make the government uncomfortable. I was at a conference in Costa Rica in September where there was a session filled with judges and journalists and lawyers in exile from Guatemala. And they primarily had gone into exile because of speaking out against government corruption and the threats that they then received due to that. But in general, I would say there is a lot of fear in Guatemala around speaking out and lobbying and political activism. It's not a friendly space for human rights workers, and that's one of the things that I think we all hope will change under the new administration, though it will not be a quick or simple fix.
Could you talk a little bit about the complexities of working in the reproductive rights space in a country with such strict abortion laws? Because I imagine you want to support sort of grassroots women's movements and that kind of thing, but you also don't want to do anything that might jeopardize the services that you deliver. So how do you go about navigating that space?
Yeah, I appreciate the informed question asking, Brody, because that is certainly a complex piece of this work. I think the stance that we have taken is that we will work on what we can within the legal frameworks that we have nationally. And we are very aware of the risk that any sort of lobbying activity, for example, could put the work that we do, the risk that could put us in. So for us, we have allied ourselves to the Ministry of Health. We are, I would say, very much sort of working within the system as much as we can. I think for me personally and for some other people on our staff, that can feel personally challenging at times because, as you mentioned, there can be a strong sort of value set and personal motivation around wanting to do more and see more happen in the country. But this institution that we're all a part of, this organization, this community that we're a part of is bigger than me. It's bigger than any one person on our staff. And I think we have a responsibility to the longevity of the organization. And that means being clear that we're not going to put that organization knowingly in jeopardy, and knowing that we're working in a controversial space. And so that requires more care than maybe for someone, for example, working in a education space or a nutrition space.
That's great. I guess that's a good segue. I'd like to sort of shift focus to you as an individual now, if that's all right. Tell me, why did you decide to work in this space, and why Guatemala?
Well, let's see. So when I actually started in all this as a teenager, and which is one of the reasons I love our adolescent peer education program. When I was 13, a number of women in my life, schoolmates and family members, began talking to me about their experiences of sexual violence. And I was a kid and I had no tools for that. But I felt a strong drive to do something and to want to be a part of preventing that happening to anyone. Yeah, so that launched me to get involved with the local Planned Parenthood. They had a teen peer education program, and that was what sparked my interest in reproductive health. And from there, a number of things happened, but think to then create the connection to Guatemala, I ended up working in Boston, running a family planning program at a couple of clinics that served primarily undocumented immigrants. And I had the opportunity over a few years to get to know a lot of patients through that program and hear their stories of why they had left home and what that journey had meant for them, what being in the U.S. As an undocumented individual had meant for them. And I got really interested in kind of upstream prevention and how to help women to not have to make this Sophie's choice, to oftentimes leave their kids behind, risk their lives, because their home countries didn't provide them with the opportunities that they needed to just meet their basic human rights and basic needs. And so that was what brought me to Guatemala. When I came here, I thought I was coming for a couple of years to get some context and then go back to continue working with undocumented communities in the U.S. And that was 10 years ago now. So I stayed.
I'm interested, was there a moment when you were younger where it went from something that was sort of interesting to you to something that you thought I could turn this into a career? And then secondly, was there then a moment later where you were like, this is what I want to dedicate myself to? And I mean, obviously it's not going to be like an immediate moment, but I'm interested, was there something that sort of galvanized those 2 points for you?
It's interesting. I spent many years actively avoiding this path, I would say.
Interesting.
I think I was fearful of defining myself and my career around the first thing that I felt passionate about as a teen. And so, I worked through this program at Planned Parenthood. I loved it. I was very passionate about it. I had an opportunity to stay there, and I decided not to, and to go to college. And at college, I studied everything that I could think of that wasn't what I ended up majoring in, which was women's studies and community health, which was exactly the path that, I could have predicted. But I did peace and justice studies and child development, and I tried out all of these different majors thinking, I want to give myself the chance to see if something else makes me as excited as this, because I didn't ever want to feel like I just pigeonholed myself early or went into the, first thing that occurred to me. And so I tried all those other things out and I realized, no, I really do, these are the majors I want. And I went and I did that, and I had other jobs. And then I ended up back at doing clinical work and counseling around family planning. And I loved it again. And when I first moved here to Guatemala, I taught English, and then I ran a school-based health center and a health education program that covered all sorts of things beyond just sexual and reproductive health. And it was fascinating, and I loved it, but I, again, felt this pull back into this work. I think for me, along the way, there's something about working in sexual and reproductive health that is this powerful bridge connector. Everybody needs to talk about these things, and nearly everybody doesn't have enough spaces in which to talk about them. Topics around reproductive health, around reproduction, around sexual health, they open up these opportunities for a really personal lens into each other's lives and a really personal connection in a pretty abbreviated way. And I think that's one of the things that I've loved about this work is it's this way to connect to somebody that feels powerful and important and authentic and impactful. And personally, I haven't felt that in other work that I've done.
That's beautiful. It's a very universalizable experience, I suppose. Who were your key influences and role models when you were younger? Was there an important teacher that pushed you in the right direction, or a public figure that you looked up to? Anything like that?
I'm sure there were. I think people that come to mind more are closer to home. My paternal grandfather was an activist preacher, and I think between him and the church I grew up in, there was a strong emphasis in my life on social justice as sort of just the way that you move through the world is through a lens of social justice. My mom similarly took me to do volunteer work since I was 5 years old and just interact with the community around me through a service lens. I had still one of my closest friends in life came into my life when we were about 13 or 14, and she came from a strong feminist activist household with a strong community organizing focus. And I think she sort of taught me that all of those things weren't other. They weren't far off from who I was, and that radical really just meant getting at the roots of things, and that feminism really centered around uplifting the individuality of each person and their right to dignity. And I think she helped me to connect to political concepts that that maybe I didn't think I was as connected to up until that moment. And I think that was also an important trampoline in terms of then how I approached more professional career in this field.
Interesting. My next question is, what advice would you give to a young person who's interested in doing the kind of work that you do? But I'm also interested in what advice you would have given to yourself at that age, say 13, when you've just met the friend that you spoke about. So I guess two levels to that question. What advice do you give to a young person who's interested in working in reproductive rights? And what advice would you have given to yourself at a young age?
I think it would probably be similar advice. The first thing that comes to mind is I would tell myself and others to get really good at listening. And maybe that's in part coming from a position of identity privilege and then the spaces that I'm working in. I think it's been a very important component to my personal path is recognizing the importance of pausing and listening and centering the voices of those who don't often get centered. At the same time, I don't know that I ever needed to be told to sort of be bold and be brave, but I think I would say that to others, that especially young people, I think there's a magic of spirit in adolescence and very young adulthood that the world needs, and we all need to benefit from that lens through which teens see the world. And so I would encourage teens to share their lens in loud and important ways, and to make themselves be listened to. And then I think probably I would have something to say around, over time, finding peace with what we can control and what we can't. I think when we do human service work, when we do human rights work, when we are confronted with things within our work that touch at deep human suffering, in order to sustain that work, we have to find our own peace with what is the impact I can have, and recognizing that there are human limitations to that, and not holding myself personally responsible for things that I cannot personally impact or change. And so I think coming around to that sense of peace and balance, while not losing the drive to constantly push the world to be better, I think that's one of the long-term projects that I would encourage someone to start as soon as they can.
That's great advice. I'd like to jump back to that first point you made, but it also ties in with the second one. In terms of that balance of listening versus being bold. Tell me, for you, when is it important to listen and when is it important to speak out and stand up?
I think, I'm sure that, tomorrow I'd have a different answer to this, but I think today I would say that a lot of it, for me, comes around to who else is in the room. And who else should be in the room. I think, when I was a 17-year-old community organizer in a room full of adults, I needed to be loud. When I'm a white American, straight presenting woman from some money working in Guatemala, I need to actively step back because power dynamics are such that my voice has a microphone to it, even if I haven't put it there. And so I have to be aware of that. So I think a lot of it comes, I think that balance between when to step up and when to step back, a lot of it comes around to who else is in the room. And again, who else should be in the room.
Mm. That's a great response. This is a rather personal question, so feel free to skip it if you like. In your biography and on the Wings website, and you mentioned at the start, you said that you have it's a little baby girl at home, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. I'm interested, did having kids change your approach or perspective on the work that you do in any way?
I think that becoming a mom made me all the more empathetic to working parents in the sphere that I'm in. I don't know that I've noticed such a shift in terms of how I would approach kind of the subject matter or the patient aspect of what we do, the clinical aspect of what we do. But as a manager and a leader within a team, I think it's made me all the more attuned to what parents on our staff are juggling. And I wish I had that insight earlier. I don't know that there's another way I could have gotten it. I worked as a nanny for many years with newborns. I thought I knew, and I did not. And so, yeah, I think there was no other way to get to it, but it's given me a new level of empathy and appreciation for what parents on our team manage in their lives.
That's great. I want to ask you about your toughest, most challenging day or experience working for Wings. And I also want to ask you about your best, most rewarding day or experience. And I'll let you decide which one you'd like to talk about first.
I think they probably in some ways go hand in hand, because I find that the moments that feel the most rewarding are the moments that we're up against the biggest challenges. It's hard. I don't know that I can tell the stories of the hardest days because they involve someone else's really personal stories of violence or suffering or trauma, and I don't know that it's my place to tell those stories. But I would say that to me, the days that are heaviest on my heart are the days that I get to have a role in supporting someone else's resilience and ability to walk through the hardest thing that they've had to face to date. And those also become my most rewarding days because those are the days that we need each other the most, and getting to be that person for somebody feels like the most important thing I could possibly do.
Fantastic. We're almost done, but I have a couple of quick fire questions that I like to ask everyone. Are you keen for that?
Sure.
All right. You're allowed to pick one person, living or dead, and you get to live their entire life from start to finish. So you pause your life right now, you live their entire life experiencing everything they've experienced, and then you come back to your life with all their memories. Who do you choose?
Oh, that feels so intimate. I believe strongly that we all hold aspects of our past and of our ancestry, and so I think I would choose a woman in my family line. I think I would probably, I don't know, but the first person that comes to mind is my maternal grandmother. I think understanding her childhood would give me such a deeper understanding of my family and my own self.
Interesting. That's a great response. 2 more questions. Firstly, what are some other organizations that inspire you and whose work you admire?
I am, in terms of organizations here in Guatemala, one that comes to mind would be Women's Justice Initiative, or Iniciativa de los Derechos de la Mujer. They're an organization that provides legal support to Indigenous women survivors of violence, and also community education around preventing gender-based violence in Indigenous communities. Another would be Maya, a school for Indigenous girls in Solola. I think also over the past several months with what was happening here in the country, I came to really greatly admire the importance of the work being done through Prensa Comunitaria and Ruda, that are 2 community-based journalism outlets here. Journalism in Guatemala as I mentioned earlier, is true journalism is dangerous here. And what that means is that the major news outlets are not covering, I would say, the truth of what's happening in the country. And so these community-based journalists are incredibly important. And in terms of whose work I admire, just so many people. I think I love working in this space because on a daily basis, I get to interact with people who have chosen to pour their heart and soul and time into work to uplift their communities, and they do so in the face of a lot of challenges, and in many cases it requires great bravery because they're putting themselves at personal risk to do this, to be human rights defenders. And so it would be hard for me to name one person. I would say I am generally most impressed by the most grassroots activists, the people whose names I would say most people probably haven't heard because their work is quite community-based. But I think that's often the riskiest and hardest work to do.
Absolutely. We'll put links to all of those organizations in the show notes so that people can check them out. A final question for you, Eleanor. If people were to donate money to Wings, what sorts of things would that money go towards?
Sure. That money would help us provide all of the clinical services that we mentioned today, provide education to adolescents. And I would also say that money would go towards supporting the many ways that as an organization we live our values. And what that means is lots of staff trainings, lots of patient follow-ups and medical audits to ensure the quality of what we do. That also means things like access to mental health care for our staff. That also means having a community advisory board so that our patients and participants in our programs can guide our strategic thinking as an organization and our decision making. So it goes to the quantitative outcomes, the numbers of people that we can reach, but it also goes to the heart of how we approach the communities that we serve.
Fantastic. Well, the idea with this podcast is that every month I want to feature a different not-for-profit organization, and then I also run a Patreon where people can support the project. So half the money helps me to keep telling stories, and the other half goes directly to the organizations that are featured. So I'll be sending that donation over to Wings very shortly. A big thank you to all the amazing people who support this project, and an even bigger thank you to you, Eleanor, for taking the time to chat with me about all of the incredible work that you and your team are doing in Guatemala. I really enjoyed the conversation and wish you all the best for the future. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Bertie. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here.
That was Eleanor Unsworth, Executive Director at Wings Guatemala. As always, I'd like to highlight 3 key points that Eleanor made, and the first is this one.
If I can't control the number of kids I have, I'm less likely to be able to feed all of my children well. And in Guatemala, half of kids are malnourished. If I can't choose how many kids to have, then the kids I do have are less likely to have access to education. And in Guatemala, the average access to education is one of the worst in the region. If I can't choose how many kids to have, there's more likely to be violence at home. Kids are stressful. And pregnancy and childbearing can be a way to control someone and keep them in a violent situation as well. It limits our ability to be able to escape domestic violence.
This was just such a succinct summary of why reproductive rights are one of the most fundamental aspects of human rights, and why universal access to contraception and family planning services should be entirely uncontroversial. The fact that it still remains a challenge in so many parts of the world is a deep injustice, and one that organisations like Wings play a vital role in overcoming. The next point I'd like to emphasise is this.
I had still one of my closest friends in life came into my life when we were about 13 or 14, and she came from a strong feminist activist household with a strong community organizing focus. And I think she sort of taught me that all of those things weren't other, they weren't far off from who I was, and that radical really just meant getting at the roots of things.
Fun fact, the word radical actually has its origins in the Latin word for root, and its earliest English usage meant forming the root. The phrase that Eleanor mentions originated with Marx in the 1840s, but was largely popularized more than a century later by the American feminist Angela Davis, who said that radical simply means grasping things at the root, encouraging people not just to fight against injustice, but to understand why injustice exists in the first place. And speaking of grasping things at the root, the final point I'd like to highlight is this.
So, Guatemala has had a really hard 100 years. Guatemala had, for the first time in a very long time, it's really first truly democratically elected president. And he was focused in large part on land rights. And he was really focused on returning land to the people. And that upset a lot of powerful actors, including the US at the time. If I'm not mistaken, the head of the CIA and the Secretary of State were brothers, and they were both on the board of United Fruit Company and had personal interest in United Fruit Company not losing land in Guatemala, and helped to support a coup here that then launched into nearly 30 years of civil war here. And within that armed conflict, there were years of genocide committed in indigenous communities in the north. And in the early 90s, peace accords were signed, but I think a lot of people would say that not a lot changed.
Eleanor's summary of Guatemala's recent history is spot on, and it's an excellent reminder that quite often poverty exists because it benefits those with power. For those looking to understand how wealthy nations exploit poorer ones for their own gain, there are few better examples than Guatemala, and I'd strongly encourage anyone listening to dig at the roots of the nation's history. There were the land grabs and horrific labour conditions of the United Fruit Company, the US orchestrated coup that toppled Guatemalan democracy, the ensuing civil war and genocide of the indigenous Maya, the IMF adjustment programs which exacerbated inequality, and the agricultural subsidies that continue to price out small-scale farmers today. With 65% of Guatemalan farmland in the hands of just 2.5% of farmers, the nation remains in desperate need of the land reforms that Arevalo and Arbenz were attempting to implement in the 1950s, and one can only hope that the recent election of Arevalo's son may finally be a step in the right direction. If you'd like to support the incredible work of Wings in Guatemala, you can donate to them directly by visiting wingsguate.org. That's wings, GUATE.org. On behalf of all the amazing people who support this project, I was able to make a donation of $140 to Wings Guatemala. If you'd like to help me give more money to more amazing NGOs in the future, please consider signing up to the Patreon via the link in the show notes for as little as $5 a month. In the show notes, you'll also find further information about a range of topics that Eleanor and I discussed during this conversation. Another big thank you to everyone who supports this podcast, and to Eleanor Unsworth for being keen to chat with me about the incredible work of her and her team. I hope you found Wings as inspiring as I did, and I'll see you next month for another episode of Protect the World.